As the world adjusts to the conflict and turmoil taking place everywhere, many in the U.S. have struggled to come to terms with these struggles taking place not only because of the many innocent lives that have been placed in danger, but also because it seems like the U.S. is ready to plunge itself into an unfathomable amount of debt in what may appear to be an investment of taxpayers' money in the welfare of their allies rather than those back at home. It becomes even more alarming when you realize that the U.S. is indebted in the trillions, and with each day that passes, the sum of this debt increases. The burning question that remains is, why does the U.S. have a debt of $33 trillion? As alarming as this may seem, especially as the U.S. seems eager to help those on the Gaza Strip and those fighting for the liberation of Ukraine from the clutches of Putin, it's interesting to know that there are some that believe this debt is useful to the U.S. economy, especially in times of emergencies. However, there are some that refuse to ignore what seems to be the obvious. Debt is simply bad for any economy, even if it's supposed to be the richest economy in the world. So what exactly could be so persuasive that it would stop the U.S. from clearing its national debt? To be honest, does it actually have to? Join us as we gain a better understanding as to why the U.S. won't pay down its national debt. As we asserted earlier, the U.S. is $33 whopping trillion in debt. Now, you know the usual question that follows when one hears how bad this debt is: who does the U.S. owe? Well, apparently, the U.S. government owed itself about $7 trillion in the form of intragovernmental debt holdings, while the remaining $25 trillion is held by the public. Apparently, the national debt is just a financial record that keeps track of the amount of dollars the government has added to the broader economy, while also keeping track of the money that has been taken away from said economy, mostly through taxation. As we try to wrap our minds around this, let's emphasize on the debt that is held by the public. As we stated earlier, the majority of the U.S. debt is held by the public, and this is mostly in the form of government securities such as treasury bonds, notes, and bills. The U.S. government is especially known to issue bonds when it seeks to borrow money. With such bonds, the government can say that it owes this individual this much money in the future, most of which come with interest. This is a tempting deal for anybody because the U.S. dollar represents the reserve currency for the world, and as such, anybody can see why anybody would be interested in owning U.S. treasuries. It's simply one of the safest investments you can make, as it's one of the best secure assets you can obtain. What one may notice is that the U.S. government only seems to incur debt for emergencies, as it seems to be easier to finance by borrowing. At least this has been considered to be an easier way to finance projects or what have you, instead of increasing taxes in a way that would be detrimental to the citizens paying them. Such periods of emergencies occurred at the turn of the century when the world was struck with a global crisis. Even more recently, the U.S. government has had to increase this debt due to the COVID-19 crisis. As such, one may be able to see how this debt has been used as a tool to grab hold of what could result in a bad situation for the U.S. economy and its citizens. The thing is, while we can understand the need to use what may essentially be a get-out-of-jail card, it becomes a problem when that's the only trick the U.S. government seems to rely on. In fact, it seems like rather than using this debt for emergencies or even long-term investments, it seems like the government is using the debt for immediate consumption. I don't think we need to say much in that anybody can tell that the constant use of this medium to fund itself not only has the ability to ruin your financial standings now, but it also has the ability to destroy any financial prowess one would hope for in the future. How exactly can the debt ruin the economy? To understand exactly how this constant reliance on the U.S. debt to stabilize the economy is going to cause problems for the U.S., we need to look at the debt-to-GDP ratio. Simply put, that can be said basically holding up your debt to the size of your economy. Apparently, the debt-to-GDP ratio is currently almost at 100%. Looking at the ratio is important because, ideally, for the economy the size of the U.S. to appear stable, that ratio should be at about the 70% ratio. This may at least suggest that such a country is capable of servicing that debt. By servicing, we mean that the debtor is paying both the debt and the interest back to the lender. One of the problems with this is that if the U.S. does not service its debts regularly, it would have to deal with the constantly increasing interest rates, which are increasing constantly. In fact, apparently the Federal Reserves have been increasing the interest rates since the earlier months of 2022, with the goal of slowing down economic activity. As bad as this may look, it's even worse in practice because the more the debt is, the more the government would have to pay. Ultimately, those who suffer for this are those who will have to do without the national programs because they cannot have funding. Imagine, the federal government had to pay $475 billion in interest alone on the national debt in 2022. While this may profit those who hold government bonds generously, and while these debts may help the economy because it may help the government embark on large initiatives like the national programs we mentioned earlier or the development and maintenance of the national infrastructure as a whole, the simple truth is that the US must monitor its debt-to-GDP ratio because this is an indicator of whether or not one can service its debts or whether the country is crumbling with the weight of the debt. Already there are worries that the US is not only passing on its debt to the next generation, but it's also passing this debt along with crumbling infrastructure and a less than stellar standard of living. As such, the government cannot ignore the need to service its debts as soon as possible so that it does not jeopardize things for the next generation. If not, what the country would essentially be doing is borrowing money from tomorrow to feed themselves today. However, there are some that do not believe that the national debt is a burden to us. While this may blow your minds, the argument against the notion that the national debt may be a burden to the future generation is that people are generally looking at the national debt like a household budget, something that they say should be avoided because the national debt and a common account are not the same. To them, while it may look like the constant borrowing may eventually lead to a situation where the government may eventually be too overwhelmed with the debt to pay up, to them, the simple matter of the fact is that this is not true. Apparently, one can see why you cannot compare the US economy to a household account when you take a look at the global economy. The global economy. Apparently, things become clearer when you look at what's going on outside the US borders. Perhaps things become clearer when it's revealed that 14 other countries have larger national debts than the US. To those who do not see the problem with the national debt, they tell you to look at Japan, the country with the largest national debt in the world. To them, the fact that Japan is still standing despite having such a large national debt shows that there is nothing wrong with them. To them, the lack of any suffering of any inflationary effects or a fiscal solvency crisis shows that this reliance on the national debt may be viable. That being said, some say that Japan has been able to avoid any crisis because it has been borrowing at very low rates. Although there are some that still won't be sold by what happened in Japan, especially as Japan seems to have an economy that is growing so slowly, one is left to ponder what Japan would have been like if it wasn't burdened with such a large national debt. Be that as it may, it seems as though some are so convinced that if the US national debt isn't monitored, it's going to plunge the country into a state of financial disrepair. That is, even despite the fact that the US is one of two countries that has a high ceiling for its debt. While Denmark isn't really bothered by it, the US is actually checked by Congress. Regardless of whether or not there should be a debt ceiling, the results are clear. Fitch Ratings Inc., the American credit rating agency, has downgraded the US long-term credit rating from AA+ to AAA. Why? Well, the constantly rising debt-to-GDP ratio could not be ignored. Perhaps even worse, the apparent lack of a clear plan to sort this out may have also played a factor in this drop in its credit rating. Finally, the lack of political stability shown by Congress, who couldn't get a proper hold of the debt ceiling, has also been a contributing factor to this dip in its credit rating. It gets even more troubling when you learn that about 30% of these debts are held by foreign governments and investors. The problem with that is that if these foreign bodies get a whiff of too much instability, it may lead to a mass ejection from these investors, and that would not help matters for the US government and the people. Despite these worries, it doesn't look like the US national debt is going anywhere anytime soon. While it remains worrisome, ultimately it isn't a full-blown crisis. That being said, the government must get a hold of it because if care isn't taken, they may create a problem for this generation and the ones to come in the future. With that, the video has come to an end. Want to watch a video about somebody who was able to get control of his money? Why don't you watch this video of Charles Ponzi, the man behind the Ponzi scheme? Also, don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Until next time, goodbye.